In this video, I want to talk a bit about scope and common mistakes. So I've made a simplified game here. Let's imagine a student's making some sort of Pong clone. Um, and they've organized their code with a paddle function that has an X and Y position for their paddle. Oops, I see I forgot to put the variables in here. I'll go ahead and add those variables. It's got an X and a Y position. Oops, the Y should be on the thing for the paddle. And then they made a key press thing where if you press A or D, you should see the paddle move. And nothing happens when you press the key. And the student is, imaginary student here is frustrated, can't figure out what's going on. So before I look at this code and analyze it, the first thing I want to just show you is how to use the Devtools to get some ability to understand what's happening. So you go to debug mode. You have to have saved the code pen before that works. That'll open a nice clean copy of the code. And then go ahead and turn on the inspector. And on your computer, this might come up in a separate window or down below. There is a little three-dot menu that will let you choose where you want it. I like mine to the right, but you might like it somewhere else. And I'm going to hit Command plus to make this code a little bit bigger. It's going to be a little hard to make it good for the video and good for me. In CodePen, all of your script comes out here as this rendered JS, and you can see it there. Actually, we're in the elements view here. You've probably been to the console view before where you can see errors spitting out. So I might see an error spit out. Oh, shoot. Well, mine just popped open the debugger because I had it set. Yours would not do that. If you can set it to automatically pause on exceptions, which I'll show you how to do in a second, and that brings you right where you want. So actually, that's probably a good place, but let me show you how to get there. So if we go to Sources, in the top tab here, and let me make this a little bit smaller so it's a little bit easier to see. You have console elements sources. Source code is going to show you over on the left-hand side, you should see two main pieces of source code. You'll see my website, that's where the library comes from, and then you'll see CodePen and your folder name and then a file. And that file is going to have all of your code for your game. Now, once you're here, you can click this little pause on exceptions. If your code is actually throwing an error, you can click pause on exceptions and see what's happening there. If you don't know where the exception is, if you're not having an error, there's another way to do it. But let's start with that. Let's hit the little stop sign that says pause on exceptions. And then in my case, I just have to click. You might have to like reload the page to make your error happen. Whatever it does that makes your error. If you click pause on exceptions, it'll remember, so you can hit reload the page and see it. And here I can see, okay, the key press handler is running, so that's a good sign. This code is actually working the way I expect it. You might see that your code isn't even running when you expect it to. And it shows you right over here some nice details about what's happening. So I can see for all the variables that are here, here's an event, and there I can see all the things that are on the event. It's got the key D, the code is key D. There's a control key. So that's a nice way to like inspect these objects. And then the error here is happening where it says X is not defined. But let me show you some more details. These Devtools have so much good stuff. It's going to be hard to see in this video. I'm trying to make the font big enough it'll show up on the video. But there's so much information, it's really hard to cram in there. But there's this scope, and you'll also see watch, which we'll get into later, but we'll start with the scope. Scope, you've heard me talk about a lot in in class, and that shows you basically where, when the code is running at line 37, what does it have access to? And so the first scope is what we call local scope. That's inside of this function. So when you're inside of this function, what's available? Well, there's a this object, which it turns out is the window. That's some JavaScriptese you don't have to know too much about, but the way that key event handlers happen, that's whatever, that's what this object is. And then there's the event that's been passed in. So right now, the only things in scope locally to this function are the event and this object. If I now were to go up to the script level, that's what's from this file. And at the script level, I just have the game object. That's so you can see all the, you can expand these and see, oh, look, there's the add click handler, the add drawing, get size. You can see everything my game gives you if you weren't sure what the options were. These are all the functions available in my game library. And it's quite simple, so there's not much. And then there's a global scope, which you probably don't care about. If you're programming well, you've got nothing in the global scope. This is like all the stuff about general JavaScript. And I mean, there's my game canvas library and my sprite library, but that's kind of it. All right. So there is no X in the scope for this handler. So that's kind of the problem. If we come back to our code, some things a student might try to do. You might try saying, oh, well, I've got event here. I want to get X here. So let me just add X and Y there. And if I go ahead and save this and refresh the page here, let's see, I don't seem to be getting an error now. So that's nice. I got rid of my exception, but I didn't make it work. So now is where this pause on exception isn't good enough. You can click right next to the line number in this these Devtools, and it will show you what's happening. So now, when I click a key, I just clicked D to make that happen. It'll pop open, and I can see, okay, what's in the local scope? Well, there's this event, which is the D key that I clicked, and now I have X is undefined and Y is undefined. So throwing extra parameters into an object like that is allowed in JavaScript. You can throw extra arguments on too. It doesn't mean they're just going to magically appear. In this case, the arguments that come to a handler are based on what key you press. They have nothing to do with your logic. So X and Y are never going to show up. But let me just show you, you can also use these step tools. So I can step into the code and see what happens. So I can see the event key was not A. The key is D, right? So now if I click this step button again, it'll step once further. And now it's going to say, okay, X undefined minus equals 10. I'll step once more. And at that point, X became not a number. Okay, so X is not a number. Now, if you're an advanced student, you might then say, wait a minute, if X is not a number, shouldn't that break this drawing? Because that drawing draws at X, right? Well, let's see what's going on. Let's go back up to add drawing, and let's put the breakpoint there. Now, add drawing is running 60 times a second, so the minute I put a breakpoint in, I'm going to see it. And now let's see what's happening here. So in add drawing, I have local. Inside of this function, I just have the context. That's the only argument I brought in. You might have more. You might have brought in width and height, and you'll see all those variables here at local. Well, I don't see X and Y at all. So where are they defined? Now it says closure make paddle. Closure means the scope that's defined by a function. So inside this make paddle function, there is this closure scope, and there in fact is X, are X and Y, right? So the X and Y here are 0, that's not a number, and 400. So that's the X inside of the make paddle closure, and then there at the script level is the next one. So if I go ahead and run it, this will keep drawing at the same place because I'm not changing that variable. All right, so that's how to use Devtools to see scope. In terms of how to actually fix this particular bug, there's a bunch of ways. Hopefully you can see them. The easiest thing would be to just take these variables and define them at a global scope. That would be X, Y, and then this will now work. Let's see here. Okay, this now works fine. I'm moving them backwards because I didn't code it very carefully, but that works well. If you have some game that you're going to have more objects and it's going to be more complicated, that's why you would have something like this make paddle business. Um, and you might end up wanting to make some kind of object or a bundle of variables or something like that, or enclose it. Um, but at the end of the day, you're either going to you're going to somehow have to get the variables from make paddle to add handler. So something has to be lifted up out of the two functions and into the global scope. Um, Easy enough to make it two variables. You could also make it, so a pattern you often might see is something like paddle equals var paddle equals make paddle, or let's say const paddle equals make paddle. And then you might have a make key press for paddle, or something like that. And in that case, what we'd be doing is passing around an object. Now, for that to work, this function would have to return an object. So you might do something like that. And then all of these x's and y's become paddle x's and paddle y's. And we return the paddle. And then we'd have to make some way to get those items into this function. So I had suggested a make key press for paddle. Let's take that. That's assuming you would eventually have different key presses for different paddles. But let's just imagine. Let's simplify it for now. So we could just say paddle.x, paddle.x. And let's pop into the inspector to see what I did wrong. And I forgot to update all the x's. So here, the Chrome Devtools are so much better than the built-in Devtools, either in Replit or CodePen or any of that stuff. There's no point in using Devtools are what professional JavaScript programmers use, and there's sort of no point in using any toy version of it. There's nothing better than the Chrome Devtools, so I really recommend using it as often as you can. And there you go, that works too. So this is a little, I made an object called paddle and returned it, but there's, for something this simple, there's no reason that's really better than just having two variables. So do whatever you can understand. Don't worry about trying to make it too fancy. All right.